Sometimes the news delivers me something I really want to talk about, mostly because it indulges my nerdiest interest. And that, this week, was that on Monday, the White House issued this bizarre statement where they praised the American victory in the Mexican-American War, also called the Mexican War, fought from 1846 to 1848. The statement is full of the usual language you'd expect from the administration, very bombastic. Trump bragging about how he has protected the United States from Mexican invaders, and clearly using the occasion of the anniversary of the Mexican-American War to make a case about the president's immigration policies and to explain why this is part of a grand tradition. But there's a real irony here. There's an irony in a Republican president speaking this way, glorifying the Mexican-American War. Because the Mexican-American War, as much as any other event in the antebellum United States, is responsible for the creation of the Republican Party, and not in the sense that Republicans were for the Mexican War. No. This was an intensely divisive conflict, something close to the equivalent of the Iraq War for people of the 1840s, a war of choice against a weaker opponent done for less than benevolent reasons. I don't want this to be a super long video, so the short story is that back in 1822, I said the short story, back in 1822, a bunch of Anglo settlers went to what is now Texas and took up space and created a republic, the Republic of Texas. Fast forward 20 years, 22 years later, an American looking towards further territorial expansion look at Texas and say, hey, we might want that. And Texans, the people in the Republic of Texas, they say, we want to be annexed by the United States. The U.S. government is more or less also led by slaveholders. James K. Polk, elected on this platform of territorial expansion, is himself a slaveholder, is buying and selling slaves from the Oval Office. Polk was looking to obtain territory in Oregon and California and what is now New Mexico. The Supreme Court is helmed by a slaveholder, Roger Taney. The Congress is chock full of slaveholders. The high positions in the Polk administration held by slaveholders. Polk administration full of slaveholders and really run for the interest of slaveholders. And this is where Mexico comes in, because Southern slaveholders, they had a theory about their institution. Their opponents did as well. And that theory was that if slavery could not expand, if it could not go beyond its borders, then it would die. Slave agriculture was heavily intensive to the land. It exhausted the land. There would be too many black people, too many enslaved people in the places where it already existed. They didn't want to become outnumbered in a dramatic sense by the people they enslaved. It was important to spread slavery out. You had to acquire more territory. And so slaveholders were a driving force, and this includes Polk, behind efforts to expand American territory. They wanted more territory for slavery. And Texas, which had some slaveholders as well, was ripe for the picking. The Texans wanted to be annexed. And so we get from James K. Polk this war for territory. We get the Mexican War. He sends 80 troops to cross the Rio Grande. The Mexican government says, hey, this is an attack on us. They push them back. And then Polk says, hey, Mexico attacked. We're going to war now. And thus begins the Mexican War. This was extremely controversial. This divided the country, again, similar to the Iraq War. Americans in the North, in particular, very much saw this as a slaveholders' war, a slave owners' war, a war for slavery, a war orchestrated by the slave power, which is what they called the kind of amalgamation of slaveholders and their allies in Washington, an effort by the slave power to tilt the scales of American government in its direction by acquiring all of this new territory. Now, the United States did win the Mexican War. And it did acquire this territory, acquired what is now New Mexico and Texas and California. But it was out of that war and out of the acquisition of new territory that we got a renewed set of political fighting over slavery. By this point, there is a mass anti-slavery movement in politics. There's the Liberty Party. There's the Free Soil Party. There are anti-slavery politicians in Congress, very strong ones. Abolitionists are gaining steam with the Northern public. And the Northern public or a large part of it, which sees this war as a slaveholders' war, is also thinking about it in those terms, thinking about it in terms of this is going to extend and protect slavery even further. And so in Congress, you get this huge debate over what to do with this territory. Will slavery be allowed in this territory? This is where we get the Wilmot Proviso by the Congressman David Wilmot saying that, no, you can't have slavery in this new territory. The Wilmot Proviso doesn't succeed, and slavery does get extended to Texas, but it is in this conflict that you get a kind of prelude to the 1860 secession crisis in 1850, where there's a real fear because Southern slaveholders are insisting on the expansion of their institution to other territory, and they're insisting on a federal government that's going to protect slavery, where they're beginning to maybe threaten secession. The emergence of the Southern Fire Eaters, these are slaveholders who are radicals, radical slaveholders, is in this moment as well. And the Compromise of 1850, which brings us the Fugitive Slave Act, is an attempt to resolve this conflict emerging out of the acquisition of all this territory from the Mexican War. It's the Mexican War that kind of destroys the Whig Party. The Whigs nominate Zachary Taylor in 1848, who basically is a blank slate and who more or less stands for exactly what the Democrats stand for. Taylor does win the presidency in 1848, but what follows is essentially the political collapse of the Whig Party, as there is no real political leadership within it. Taylor dies. He's replaced by Millard Fillmore, who's vice president, and Fillmore is the one who actually signs the Compromise of 1850. And Fillmore kind of leads the Whigs to oblivion, in part because the Whigs just didn't stand as a meaningful opposition party to the slave power. And so it's out of the Mexican War, out of the collapse of the Whig Party, out of a schism within the Democratic Party, anti-war Democrats, anti-slavery Democrats, called barn burner Democrats, breaking off from the mainline Democratic Party to oppose the Mexican War and to oppose the expansion of slavery. It's out of the Mexican War and its consequences that you get the formation of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is a response in a lot of ways to the settlement of the Mexican War. The Republican Party formed in 1854 by former Whigs, former Democrats, former Liberty men, and former Free Soilers. It should also be noted here that the Mexican War is this kind of weird little prelude to the Civil War, and that a lot of the familiar faces of that war, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Winfield Scott, George B. McClellan, and many others, saw service in the Mexican War and learned important lessons about war fighting that they would bring to the Civil War. This is all to say that there's a tremendous irony in the modern-day Republican Party embracing the legacy of the Mexican War and embracing this notion of territorial conquest as an unambiguous good for the country. A Republican Party that formed in part in opposition to that is now a Republican Party that is embracing it, embracing not just some form of territorial acquisition, or at least President Trump, but embracing the notion that the purpose of the government is to extend the domination of some groups over others. What an irony. A bad one, but a striking one nonetheless. Thank you for watching this as always. If you like this video, check out this one and consider subscribing to the channel. I'll see you next time.